All right. Well, we're back with Murray, and we want to talk a bit more about Celtech, sulfur. The importance of sulfur, and one of the bridges that we want to use from the last segment to this one is talking about mine sulfur versus sulfur from the back of an oil and gas plant, and what are the differences, and why is that going to be such an issue as we progress through 2050, as trying to mostly, hopefully, decarbonize and not get rid of oil and gas, because there are some issues when you look at that mine sulfur side.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, not all countries have oil and gas. I mean, we've all learned that. And in Canada, we have a lot of sulfur. We produce a lot of sulfur with our sour oil and gas. Anybody's been out to Vancouver, they see in the massive piles, and we're exporting it. But it's an expense to a country that doesn't have sulfur. So there is another sulfur source. Anybody who's ever been to a natural hot springs, that rotten egg smell, that is sulfur that you're smelling. And there is veins of sulfur in the Earth's crust. I believe it's like 13 or 15% of the Earth's crust is actually sulfur. So it's easily mined. It can either be hard rock mined, or it can be similar to a hot extraction. They pump steam down, the sulfur melts, and then they pump up the molten sulfur. The problem with natural sulfur is it's in with the rock, it's in with the other metals, and it's high in heavy metals. So countries that don't have oil and gas sulfur, that are using what we call mine sulfur, over time have actually started to build up heavy metal content in their soils. And our fruits and vegetables, our crops actually start to absorb these heavy metals. And we're starting to see that in different parts of the regions of the world where, the land's still arable, it's still productive, but there's so much heavy metal now in the soil, the crop that's coming off it isn't good for us. We're learning this now. So the great thing about oil and gas sulfur, byproduct of oil and gas, is the process that they extract it from the oil and the gas actually purifies it. The sulfur that we get from gas plants in southern Alberta is 99.996 to 998 pure sulfur. You're never going to find sulfur that pure and lack of heavy metals when it's mined. So it's a great source for being put into our crops, our soil amendment, our food sources.
So, and just going back to our previous section, Dr. Stephen talked about how if you're around volcanoes, if you had this natural sulfur that was already existing on the ground, but then since 2008, when we really created that crossover point, not having the SO2 come down naturally, depleting the soils just from constantly, farming and whatnot. We're starting out right now with 33% of the world's soils that are depleted in sulfur, but it's only going to get worse. So I think I want to turn it back to Murray, and he can talk about ways that we need to really get back to these building blocks. We talked about the importance of, obviously technology is important, but we also need these base ingredients, because it just comes back down to Mother Earth and giving it the crops the nutrients that are needed to address some of these shortages.
So it's interesting. So sulfur is a building block. I mean, we as humans need sulfur. Sulfur is what builds bricks content, sugar content, everything from garlic, onions, sugarcane, sweet potatoes, the oil, the protein level in yellow peas, canola oil, your sunflower seed oil. So it's this massive building block that's there. But in the previous segment, Shipo talked about sulfur needing nitrogen, needing sulfur to take it up. So it's called an NS ratio. And it's really interesting. You have to be a really good agronomist in wheat to notice that you have a sulfur deficiency or a nitrogen deficiency, because they're both very similar and symptomatic. If you don't have sulfur, and it's called the NS ratio, the plant can't uptake the nitrogen if it doesn't have the sulfur. So the two are linked together. So as we've started to have more and more depleted soils, people will actually start applying more nitrogen, thinking that they're showing nitrogen deficiencies, wanting yield. But without the sulfur in the soil, the plant just can't take up the nitrogen. So NS ratio, and as we learn more, and there's less free sulfur falling from the sky, our soils are becoming depleted. It was interesting. It used to sit there and say, like, a canola crop was a 10-to-1 NS ratio. For every pound of nitrogen, you need 1 pound of sulfur. Canola crops now, they're actually saying it's actually 6-to-1. Wheat used to be, you know, not worried about. Now they're saying wheat is like an 8-to-1. You need that to grow a wheat crop. Nobody would ever think that wheat needed the sulfur, but it's that uptake of nitrogen, it's uptake of, you know, like that. So it's interesting enough. And then, you know, I know sulfur. I don't know that, but it's zinc also. They're talking about, you know, how zinc helps bring in the nutrients, helps the plants bring in those nutrients. So it's not just the NPKs of that everybody sees a big, it's the, you know, it's the micros and the macros together that are really where we have to build up that soil. We have to take care of that so the plants can uptake it.
And just to simplify, because I also like pretty pictures, you can kind of see the flow chart in terms of how things are going through, and how just on a simplistic level, you have less sulfur coming in, which then means that the uptake is diminishing. And now you may get a similar yield, but the quality of what you're coming out with, and then over time, you know, we've talked about how the amino acids within wheat are changing, which is changing the flavor profiles, making it harder to work with. And if you know, earlier we talked about the importance of costs. You know, if we really want to get serious about no hunger, if we want to try to address the fact that we're going to have just under 10 billion people by 2050, you know, what are we feeding them with? Like, with what are we going to continue to go down? And that's when we go to the next component. Through. So the frozen. So when we start looking at the insecurity side, so when you look at the UN has done a really good job of trying to show just insecurity levels and food insecurity, and the importance of what we're trying to address. So one of the things, and it was talked about and touched on in our previous segment, the problem is 2016 was really the peak for yield. Since 2016, you've actually seen global yields either flatline or actually start to fall, and at a precipitous level. So when you look at the two key components, and Sheepo mentioned it, rice and wheat. You know, most people, rice is the staple. For others, it's wheat. And from a country level, more countries depend on wheat. So when you start looking at the problems and the number of people that are seeing these struggles, this is why we have to get so serious about it. And really, because realistically, everyone talks about innovation. People, if they're concerned about eating, if you think about Maslow's hierarchy, if I don't know where my next meal is coming from, I can't sit there and pontificate of what's coming next. I can't sit there and play with my computers and my AI if I have to worry about going out and tending a garden. So when you start looking at some of these different pieces, and not to say that tending garden isn't great, it's just in terms of actually staying alive. So when you start looking at these issues, and then this is where it really hits home, when you start looking at the issues between the what is driving it. And I think the biggest two pieces is obviously the countries that are economically challenged, and then weather shifts. So when you look at the amount of people that are impacted by that, cost becomes so important. So finding a low cost solution, because yes, technology is cool, but there's a lot of companies and countries that can't afford a drone, that can't afford some of these things. So how do we get back to basics and that simplicity? And that's where we look at sulfur, and there is a meaningful way to provide that cheaper solution, and really addressing the fact, and again, it's eco-friendly. And I think it's important for Murray to go through why sulfur being eco-friendly is so important when you're looking at some of these developed nations.
So you know, I think both, you know, Stephen and Sheepo had talked about education in developing countries and understanding. And there's been some really great programs from different governments and industry trying to make sure that people don't apply. And we've all done it. I mean, I'm gonna say I know I've done it as a you know, and some of my own personal projects, that if a little bit's good, well, then a little bit more is going to be better, and a bunch more is going to be great. And that's a real problem with synthetic fertilizers. Synthetic fertilizers have got a really delicate sweet spot. Underapplied, really not going to get the benefit. Overapplied, you know, risk of damaging and that. So nice thing about elemental sulfur, not a sulfate, is it's very eco-friendly. Overapplied, there's no damage or hurt, and underapplied, it'll still be effective in what it's doing, just not as effective. So Where we're starting to see a lot just at ourselves is people are really coming up with a lot of eco-friendly fertilizers that aren't pure eco-friendly. They're a blend, they're a hybrid. They've got some synthetic fertilizer, but a lower amount, and then whether it's a rock phos or, you know, a manure or an organic matter. So I'm really thinking that, you know, again, we talk about education, understanding. The more that we're working with eco-friendly, safer fertilizers, there's that less chance of damaging the soil over time. And, you know, when we do talk about, you know, the soils, the soil health that, you know, I know we'll be talking about here in a minute, that's probably one of the biggest things that we're seeing is that correction. And like I say, this also comes back to damage of over application. I think Sheepo talked about Brazil thinking we'll just pile the phos in when we've got the money, it'll be there. It's there, but it's not available. And it's now causing some other issues. So this is where it's that, you know, a safer or less adverse, you know, products.
And I think it's important to define micro and macronutrient, because what does that mean? And you're actually starting to see sulfur, for an example. Like we've had conversations with people, and they're like, "Well, sulfur is a micronutrient." It's like, well, it depends on where you are, and it may be a micronutrient now, but give it 4 years, and all of a sudden it's going to be a macronutrient. So when we talk about the importance of education and explaining to the farmer, look, things are changing, but again, they're businessmen. They want to make sure that they can, you know, feed their family, that they're going to have their farm the next year. So there's also that hesitancy to change, which is why it's so important from a research perspective to show, no, you can change and you can have a meaningful adjustment. But I think it's important to understand the difference between the two and how those can really vary as we look across different areas.
What's interesting, and again, I'm going to draw when we talked about irrigation, you know, Stephen talked about, you know, aquifers depleting, becoming more, you know, higher in sodium, and you know, us in Alberta, the Rocky Mountains, high in lime, they actually tie up all these micronutrients. So it's very interesting. You look in the Tabor Brooks where we built aqueducts to feed the original railroad, the steam engine. And then we started irrigating crops with it. That hard lime water that builds up in your kettle, it starts to raise the pH. And what they've now noticed is all that calcium is tying up all the micronutrients. It's tying up the zinc. It's tying up the iron. It's and it's also raising the soil pH. So, you know, anytime you have above a 7.4 pH in soil, it actually, the plant struggles to develop a root system. It has a trouble actually taking up the nutrients. So the farmers then start up again, putting more synthetic fertilizer down, hoping that it's available and the plants are able to uptake it. We've been working with some groups out of, you know, BYU to try and correct these high soil pHs. And, you know, ours is, like I say, a very natural way of doing it. But it's not only do you see, they use a thing called a root simulator probe, and basically it's a resin stick, and every 4 weeks it absorbs nutrient out of the ground at the same rate a plant would. They were developed by U of S. And so every 4 weeks you put these resin sticks in the ground and you take them out, you wash them, and then you measure what plants were taken up there. And as you lower the soil pH, you know, through the acidification, like the sulfur, it actually starts releasing this. And it's amazing the increase in micronutrients actually increase the yield. The NPK is the same in all of them, but it's the micronutrients that are allowing the plant to be happier, get that full balance of what it needs, and is actually increasing the yield. So it's not just the NPK and its uptake, it's that balanced nutrient that by releasing that's locked up in the soil, releasing the soil is helping.
And one last point on this, and I'll turn it over to Murray to explain it. You know, one of the things that we've heard a lot at COP28 and prior is the importance of biochar. You know, the organic matter, bringing back carbon, but it's a net neutral. You know, so how do you enrich it? How do you have what is called as a carrier to give it value? Do you put it into a compost? But the problem is, if you put it into a compost or some manure, like we're talking with chicken litter, you know, typically humans, livestock, we absorb sulfur. So you have to add it back in. And with this research, there's a lot of opportunities, but I think it's important to understand, well, it's great, but it's still not there. And that's why you have to look at optimizing what is currently out there. And I think sometimes there's this view of goal-oriented economics going from 0 to 100. Well, it's like, well, it's not fully renewable, therefore we can't invest in it. It's like, no, it's okay to go from 0 to 60 with a path to 100%, because we have to make those leaps and bounds, but it's going to happen over time. And I think biochar is an interesting one, but the importance of the carrier behind it.
And then I'm just going to give a quick little background on Saltec. When we first started, we thought we could make a better elemental sulfur. There is other elemental sulfurs out there, kind of chunk sulfur, sulfur bentonite products. And we just wanted to make a better elemental sulfur, make it smaller, increase the surface area. The best way to describe our product is if you have a swimming pool and you throw a 5-pound block of ice in it, or you throw a 5-pound bag of crushed ice. The crushed ice dissipates, melts in a very short time. The block of ice is probably still there 2 days later. That's kind of what we've done. We've just micronized the sulfur. We thought we'd make a better mousetrap. When we found out, actually through independent research through the Alberta government, we actually, made a product that worked as good as synthetic sulfur in a normal year and outperformed in wet and dry years. So that was okay. We've got something here. We then were approached about soil amendment, soil health, soil pH, soil content, and we went, okay, this is a great product there. And so this was all pre-COVID. During COVID, we were, adopting into the market. Now with sustainability, we have been pulled along. We never approached this, but people that are doing interesting, exciting things with either biochars, manures, compost, recycled materials, byproducts similar to ours. We've been probably 60% of the products we make now are value add into other people's products. So biochar, Mark had mentioned, it's amazing food for bacteria. It looks like a sponge. It creates great, a great colonizing, but you need something to go with it to really add that value, to make it economical for the farmer, put something else with it, not just the biochar, the carrier. And there's some great carriers that are being developed out there, and people are way to find effective ways to use it. And we're just really happy to be part of that. We have 12 different products that use our micronized sulfur as a kicker, as low as 3% to their product and as high as 35%. And it's interesting. We just recently got another call down in Sears, Michigan, and they're doing organic dairy. Basically the green manures, but they're trying to put them back on their fields. And as Mark had mentioned, there's no sulfur in green manures from the dairy industry. So we're doing 2 applications where they found that our product could blend in. So now it's saving fuel. It's now helping that whole carbon story of how many times did you go to the field? What are you hauling out there? Like, one pass hauls it all. So we have a product called a program we call Share the Tank, and it's working with the farmers to how many times or how many processes can we do at one? How many can we blend it? And that's, again, Mark talks about baby steps. It's no magic pill. We're not going to go from 100 to 0, but if we can go, 5 at a time. And this is where we did not see it. We weren't brilliant and saw this. We actually got pulled along by other people that said, hey, this would help my product be more effective. This actually helps the farmer. He's one less pass. And like I say, we like to say we're smart and we saw it coming, but we didn't. We really got pulled into this, and it's been great.
And so this is looking at some of the UN data slightly differently, because one of the things, and I'm sure anybody who's built a home or had to get something built, it's like, oh, no, COVID. COVID was the reason. No, it's fine. It's a COVID problem. Well, this is not a COVID problem. This is something, if you go back to 2016, you can see it's only gotten exponentially worse. And the problem is the severity is getting worse. And when you're looking at people that are moving from, to some sort of slight insecurity to now they're going hungry on a regular basis, we're approaching almost 1 billion people. And right now we're at about 800 million. And based on our current yield trajectory, we're likely to be at over 1 billion within the next 18 months. And we have to find these cost-effective solutions. So when everyone says, "Oh, natural gas is evil," natural gas is oil is evil, and it's funny when you look at the U.S., the narrative has shifted. Oil was evil; it's still evil, but natural gas went from a bridge fuel, and now they don't talk about a bridge fuel anymore. Now it's a fuel of the future. And I think that we have to get realistic. Back to what Dr. Stephen was talking about. There's a lot of byproducts that come out of this. If I can take these byproducts, like if you look at Saltec, if I can take this byproduct, I can reduce the carbon emissions. I can reduce GHG. Murray had mentioned there was talk about NO2. NO2 is 352 times worse in the atmosphere than carbon. So if we can sit there and say, I'm going to put this sulfur on the ground and I'm going to enable the farmer to reduce their NO2 emissions, it's like, well, that's a real number. That's a real impact while giving them a cost-oriented solution. Because I think here it's important to talk about the economics of Soltech. And right before we started this segment, we were talking about the importance of bringing down costs, but how can we do that in a meaningful way?
So our business model is we go right on the back of the gas plant. We've we work with the right now the sour oil and gas producers in Alberta. We go right on the back of the gas plant. So when sulfur is refined and comes out of a gas stream, it's actually almost at the exact temperature I want it. And so we use what we call a steam blanketed jacketed line, and our process is exothermic. We're not adding any energy to it. So we're able to basically take the sulfur, a byproduct, we're getting out of the sour oil and gas, or the gas for us right now, and it's coming off their process at the temperature I want. We're not trucking it, and we're exothermic. We basically are dissipating that energy. We're not adding any energy to it. So, and our process is very vertical. So we don't have a lot of pumps. We have very low rotating equipment. And when it comes out of our process, it's field ready. It's also blend ready. So it's not like now you're taking sulfur, for example, an export where you're, making it shipping sulfur, export sulfur, then sending it somewhere, either remelting it, reprocessing it. When it comes off the plant, it's ready to go into the field, or it's ready to blend into another product. And it just saves those extra steps. So that's why we've been very effective. I said, we're not adding trucking, we're not adding, a carbon footprint to it. And like I said, being exothermic, we're not adding that energy component to it. We're using the energy that they already had to put into it just to recover it, to separate it, to make gas burnable in our homes and vehicles.
So this is a point that I think it's important to highlight when you look at soil amendment. And one of the biggest issues is we've talked about a growing populace, but yet we don't have the ability. We have the least amount of arable land really over the last 100 years. So we're asking the land to do more, but because we're abusing it and because of just years of weathering it in and using synthetics. Because when you look at our history in the 1930s and on up, we've talked about how we've always had these big increases when we discovered synthetic fertilizer. Then we started using mechanized equipment. Then we started using precision farming, and we've had these big yield increases, but we've stagnated, and now it's going to become a much bigger problem. And unfortunately, if people can't eat, when you talk about conflict, when you talk about war, if from a politician's perspective, and this is when it comes to policy, you're going to have to see policy adjust, because people are going to get angry if they're not eating. I mean, it's a very basic means. Like, I think sometimes we forget that we are animals. If I can't get my food, I'm going to go across the border and I'm going to go get their food. And when you start to see just the ramifications and the knock-on effects, which is why I think we do have to get so focused on soil amendment and finding ways to increase the arable components. And I think Murray does a great job of highlighting what does that mean and how can we do it in a short period of time, because everyone talks about it's like, oh, I have this great product, this great widget. It'll be out in 2045. It's like, okay, that's great, but what are we doing now? And I think we need now ready products.
Yeah, it's definitely exciting and interesting on that side, that everybody's looking at something new. And in Canadian agriculture, there's two kind of interesting jokes. The first one is farmers love to be first at being second. And you got to respect that. This is their land. Nobody wants to try an experiment on their land. I mean, if you have a small grow box and somebody at a farmer's market convinces you to try something, you might try it. But this is their farmland. This is their livelihood. And so, they're very cautious, but they are the early adopters. There's more, the farmers are, I'm going to say they're getting way better educated. They're doing their own research. They're just not believing what they hear. They actually do their own research. The shift is there's more what they call early adopters. There's more innovative farmers now as a percentage. If you look at the stats, and then even the follow-on is the adoption of the other farmers that follow along, that just what the neighbors doing looking over the fence is actually increased, because you look at agriculture. Agriculture has been trying to, take those baby steps and make them more and more and more. So we're definitely, seeing that and excited about that. And then one of the things like we're doing with some other countries that are asking, again, when I say like to share the tank, it's also share the granular. They're asking the larger fertilizer companies, they're asking where the countries that import, that don't have, natural gas and that to make fertilizers, they're an importer. They're saying, can I get more in that pastille or that granular? What else can we get? So we're actually seeing the market saying, we just don't want 5 or 12 products. Can we start getting co-granulated products? We want more. And again, this is what we talked when Sheepo was earlier about more and more products that everybody's developing.
The one thing that's funny now, it wasn't at the time, during COVID, especially when you look at the US, when you went to the food store, it wasn't, can I get apples? It was, what variety of the 15 do I want? And then all of a sudden during COVID, it was, well, there's no apples this week. I'm going to have oranges. And it was almost like a little bit of a wake up call where people were shocked that I can't choose. I have to take what's available. And it was a bit more about how the other half lives. And I think there was a bit of an awakening, which is important. And I think we have to see, in the heart of COP28, more of this policy shift of, I get it, obviously no one's going to turn down free money if we get grants, but I think the policies have to support the situation. Instead of saying, look, natural gas is evil, oil is evil, it's like, let's find a way to use these byproducts. Let's find a way to take what's there and optimize what is available and bring down these footprints, because there are ways and technologies out there from carbon capture. We've heard from Premier Danielle Smith, from Scott Moe, talking about carbon sequestration, the importance of, managing these different pieces. And again, it's a basket approach. Like when Murray talks about the toolbox and the importance of having all these different options, policy is a big part of it, because you also have to have that technology share, taking that technology from one region to another. And the UAE, as we talked earlier, is a natural crossroads. And I think we have to get more open and really more supportive in terms of policy on trade commissions, and pulling in some of these opportunities. And, we've had a lot of support from the Canadian government, from the US government, in terms of trying to get this product out there and finding these real solutions to really build up these building blocks that are cost effective. Because I think, Murray, it would be good to talk about the economics of the Soltec product and just where we are in terms of cost against the alternative, and also the yield enhancements and the reduction of synthetics that are out there when using Soltec.
So we'll just talk straight, nutrient value. So we, did a lot of research to make sure that, we could supply a crop the sulfate requirements over the entire grow season. And that this last 2023 season in Southern Alberta, the price of fertilizer, again, world shortages in fertilizer demands, we were, pound for pound of delivered nutrient, saving the farmer on an oilseed crop, $7,000 to $8,000 a section, which, as a farmer, he's in business, but their thing they're happy with is, am I sacrificing yield? Am I sacrificing application time? Like, is this going to cost me more somewhere else to save money? And when it doesn't, they're definitely looking at that as an advantage. So they're like, okay, I'm not spending more money to use a different product, even though it may be cheaper, but am I also going to still get the same yields, the same production? So this is where, again, our process, we go in the back of the plant, it's field ready right now. It doesn't have to get trucked, reprocessed in a plant, value added. So this is where our goal is to build, we're going to hopefully have a facility here soon in the States also, but it's basically build field ready products right in the back of the gas plant. So they are cost effective. You're not having to repurpose, reprocess, and that way it's ready to go.
So before we have closing remarks, or any questions out there that of anyone about anything that we've discussed over the last 2 hours? I like it.
My question is, it's simple. Soltec brings about micronized sulfur. Are you seeing this as an alternative to ammonium sulfate or sulfate-based sulfur, or do you see this as a product that will supplement or redefine that space, of using sulfate sulfur?
Definitely, it's a definite replacement for AMS or thiosulfates, any of your synthetic sulfate fertilizers. We actually see it as more than that. Your sulfate fertilizers have two inherent problems. First of all, osmotic pressure. We talked about this, the salt index. There's a glass ceiling. You can only put so much ammonium sulfate or thiosulfate. It's in farming terms we call it hot. It affects germination. So you have a glass ceiling. So depending on how depleted your soils are, and again, I use the word Mother Nature, the soil, what it does. You don't always control where nutrients go. So if you're massively deficient, you only can put so much in there. You don't always control where it goes. I talked about even our own product, high calcium soils. Sometimes the calcium will tie up some of our sulfates. So that's the first problem. The second problem, and we talked about some stuff in Australia, sulfates are very, very mobile in the soil with moisture. Sandy soils, they can move hundreds of feet, just with the water and, hills, land and runoff. And one of the biggest problems that we're seeing with the ammonium sulfate is with high moisture areas, sandy soils, is it's not there. They're reapplying it. Like, Australia's had adverse weather conditions. They're called rain bombs. 2 feet of rain in 3 days, and the sulfates are gone. And for a sugarcane crop, they literally had to reapply synthetic sulfates 3 times just to try and save the crop. Where the nice thing about elemental sulfur is potentially it's not water soluble. It sits in the soil. The bacteria, consumes it. It expresses it as SO2, becomes SO4. The plant takes it up. But if it hasn't taken it up and we had a rain bomb, the sulfate that had been converted would disappear, but the elemental's still there. That when the sun comes out, the bacteria goes back to work and it's there. So the sulfate fertilizers in high moisture areas, sandy soils, leaching are definitely a problem, which we solved that problem, hands down. In dry areas, again, we talked about osmotic pressure. There is no salts. The bacteria does the job. So you're helping crops there. But as far as delivering sulfates, the great thing about our micronized sulfur and the particle size is the bacteria is delivering right from it hits the soil within days of it hitting the soil, but it's also still there at the end of the crop season. So our particle sizes are designed that they're still there at the end of the growth cycle when you're forming that seed, when you're forming that yield, and it needs it, for the protein in the actual product. So sulfur is not mobile. So it's in a sense, it's a time release based on the particle size. So that's where we're definitely outperforming. And right now, the energy that goes in North America to make sulfate fertilizers, we definitely have a cost advantage and an application advantage and safety. Again, we don't have to worry about damaging the seed and germination or, the surrounding water systems.
I'm getting excited. I promise you, this is my last question. In practical terms, and you've touched on this aspect. You spoke about, actually Mark spoke about, the energy intensive, nature of fertilizer, and I want to put this for the both of you. From production side, you spoke about these fancy things in field application, but from production side, is micronized sulfur an energy intensive process? And the other question is, sulfur has always been, a dicey element, to handle in fertilizer plant, around safety and so forth. How does your product address both these topics, just in brief?
So just a quick briefing on how our process works. So we basically take molten sulfur, anywhere from about 140 to 150 degrees C, and we pressurize it to anywhere from 2,000 to 3,000 PSI. I do apologize, I'm mixing my units. And it goes through our patented process, and we basically inject it into a water polymer bath. So the sulfur actually micronizes in what we call a target vessel. And we then separate it out from the water. The water loops back to the beginning of the process and that. So like I say, we're exothermic. We're not adding heat to the sulfur as it comes off the sulfur recovery unit. The only thing we're doing is we're adding energy as in pressurizing the sulfur to get it so that we can put it in through our patented nozzles into a stream, but we keep it wet. So the sulfur, we have it in 3 different forms. One of them is chemtotes, where it's 65% sulfur, 35% water. Or else we have it in flexitotes that we ship either to the farmers or to other people to process, and we keep it 11% surface moisture. And even though our particles are between 5 and 600 micron, they have a mean particle size around 70 micron. Anything less than 50 microns dust, and yes, sulfur dust is very dangerous. It's just like grain dust. So that's why we leave it at the surface moisture at 11%. Anything below 5% would be considered dangerous goods by OH&A. So at 11%, it's safe. It's like wet sand. And so it's very safe that way. And like I say, being exothermic, we actually, we're not adding a lot of energy. So we're using the energy from the gas plants is what we're using. And so we're not adding energy. So we have a very low energy footprint, 1/20th of that of synthetic sulfates. And we are working actually to become net zero. We're looking at either solar panels, or one of the gas plants we're working at is actually going to take flue gas and start generating electricity from their flue gases and that's the electricity I want for my plant. So then we would actually be a net zero plant nutrient soil amendment product at our plant gate.
And,
just really quickly, you sparked another idea in my mind. So is there an opportunity for the gas plant operator to absorb some sort of carbon credit through this process? And particularly when you're talking about the nitrous oxide reduction that the application to the soils create. So just curious about that and where your thinking is.
So Murray usually allows me to talk about all of the SDGs and the pieces on the credits. So the short answer is not yet. The long answer is yes. And the reason why is because when you start looking at scope 1 to scope 3 to scope 4, you start to look at the impacts. And it's funny because when you talk to some of the individuals that think oil and gas are evil and some of these things, it's like, well, they're like, I can't wait for scope 4 to come out so I can start talking about where are the raw materials for some of these panels, what are the coatings, what are the plastics, and then what does the end of life look like? Because I think when you focus on too much of a narrow piece, you struggle. But as we start to broaden, and this is where it comes back to policy, and we had these conversations in London, where if I'm the farmer who's now, okay, we share the tank, we're allowing them to use less diesel, because we're so sulfur dense, there's less shipments, but now I'm actually trapping NO2. If I'm trapping NO2 that's 352 times worse than CO2, shouldn't I get some sort of elevated amount? And it's interesting because when you talk to people about carbon credits, there's an understanding that you need more volume. So instead of getting rid of the carbon markets like we saw in 2020, where you in 2022, where you had this big issue in Europe, once you had Russian natural gas not coming in, you saw these massive spikes in power prices. You actually couldn't bring coal plants on because the carbon credits to offset your carbon from coal still made it uneconomic to turn on. So instead, they had to pause the system. They had to put a ceiling. So now they're like, well, is there a way we can add liquidity? And one of the things that we've said is we go to the farmer and we can say, look, I can actually lock something in here. Now, then we talk to biochar. Biochar, you can actually sell what's called corks. So the corks biochar will hold carbon in the soil, even in a tilled environment, where if I'm the farmer and we can then add value and to optimize both the micro and the macronutrients, because I'm going to re-energize the soil with not only nutrients, but also natural bacteria. So I can use less pesticides. And now I have this carbon rich soil that is going to last, they estimate 100 years. I'd be happy with 10. So if I can put this carbon, now I'm absorbing carbon. We know soil inherently has it, which is why there's the till versus, excuse me, no till. So there's a ton of opportunity. And I think instead of treating the farmer almost like a criminal or evil, where it's like, oh, you guys are polluting. No, it's like they can be part of the solution, but you have to reward them. You have to incentivize it. And I think when you start looking at that scope 1 to scope 4 basis, there's a lot of ways. And the benefit for us is we're that connector from the farm to the gas plant. So once that becomes more defined, we will be able to pass that benefit up into the gas plant. Plus, we are also taking excess steam, excess heat, excess electricity. So we're also optimizing their consumption. So that's a benefit if you look at just a scope 2 basis. So as you keep stepping out and being all encompassing, there is a lot of value that we derive and delivered not only to the farmer, but also to the E&P company and the midstream processor. And then the last piece that I wanted to touch on, just in terms of what Sheepa was kind enough to ask, the other piece is the importance of the other macronutrients. And Stephen was kind enough to talk about, phosphorus and phosrock and the weathering of it using sulfuric acid. The benefit with what the product is that we're talking about is we naturally weather phosrock. So we allow a about 65% faster weathering, making it more available in the soils at that time. So the other thing is, and to Sheepa's question about bringing down or replacement of AMS, or are we something different, it's an optimization piece. And I think that's the biggest point. And I'll turn it to Murray for last comments when you look at that optimization and some of the things that we can do going forward.
Yeah, it's interesting. By feeding the microbes, and like I say, the sulfur comes out as SO2. There's a really lot of research being done around the world right now with natural rock phos, soft rock phos. In Alberta, we joke they're dinosaur bones, and like there's been research in India, Egypt, Australia, Germany, throughout the United States, and we call it weathering. It's weathering the rock, and it almost 3 times the available phos. So if you were to send it to the lab, it says 30% phos and rock phos, but it's maybe 3% water soluble available to the plant. You put it with elemental sulfur, bacteria, the microbes do their job. It's 8-9% now available to the plant. And we're doing some stuff in Brazil right now, and in the earlier they talked about Brazil over applying phos, thinking it would be sitting in the soil. It's now tied up, so we have to weather that to get it released. And elemental sulfur is actually one of those products that, as the bacteria converts it over to SO2, would actually help weather it. So again, it's using what's available to us from Mother Nature. We're doing a really interesting product, and I would have never saw this a year ago. It's funny, there's a group in United States, a group in Brazil, and a group in Canada that are all doing chicken litter from the high organic omega eggs. And we feed these chickens this amazing rich diet, and they're not that efficient to make the great eggs, like these high quality eggs. So their litter is amazing in all the micronutrients and it's how do we get those, and then how do we get them to weather. So this is what I say, I'm really excited about all these different groups and people that are doing stuff that's not mainstream, not synthetic fertilizer, and the eco-friendly fertilizers that are out there. It's exciting to see, and we love to get in the calls. We get a lot of calls that said, hey, can you help us, or have you done this? And what's interesting is it's a great community. It's not like, okay, we've worked out this problem. If you're trying to do something, the guys in Brazil, we're like talking to the guys in Kelowna, BC, saying, this is what we did that worked, this was what failed. And they said, oh yeah, we had the same failures. And so I think everybody's really working towards some great projects. So like I say, you're going to see an acceleration.
And that's why it's all about partnerships. And I think that's the great piece of where we are and the partnerships that can be built. So if you have any questions, you'll have our information on the site, and we'd love to hear from you. If we didn't get to it, if you have a burning question, you also have access to people on the panel, and we appreciate the time. Thank you.